The rain fell in relentless sheets, drumming against the cracked pavement of a quiet street in East Hollow. It was the kind of evening where the world seemed to shrink, where every sound was swallowed by the hiss of water and the occasional groan of a passing car. Daniel Reese pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders, the collar frayed and damp, his boots scuffing against the uneven sidewalk. He was 42, though the lines etched into his face told a story of years heavier than that. His hands, rough from years of odd jobs, fixing pipes, hauling boxes, patching roofs, shoved deeper into his pockets as he trudged home from the hardware store. Another day, another paycheck, barely enough to keep the lights on. He didn't see the wallet at first. It was half buried in a puddle, its leather edges curling like a wilted flower, the clasp glinting faintly under the street lamp's weak glow. Daniel stopped, his breath fogging in the cold air, and squinted down at it. For a moment, he considered walking past. It wasn't his problem. He had enough of his own. Rent due in 3 days, a fridge with nothing but a jar of pickles and a half-empty carton of milk, a daughter who hadn't called in months. But something tugged at him, a quiet nudge he couldn't name, and he bent down, fishing the wallet from the water with a grimace. It was heavy, sodden, the kind of weight that hinted at more than just coins. He wiped it on his sleeve, the leather dark and scuffed, and flipped it open. No cash, just cards, a driver's license, and a faded photo of a woman with silver hair and a gentle smile, her arm around a younger girl with wide, bright eyes. The license read, Eleanor Grayson, 78 years old. An address a few blocks away stared back at him, the ink smudged but legible. Daniel's jaw tightened. He could drop it at the police station tomorrow, let them deal with it, or he could toss it back into the puddle and forget he'd ever seen it. No one would know. But then he thought of his mother, gone 5 years now, her hands trembling as she'd counted out coins for groceries, her voice soft as she'd said, "Do the right thing, Danny, even when it's hard." He sighed, a long, weary sound, and tucked the wallet into his jacket. The rain soaked through his clothes as he turned down a side street. The address burned into his mind. Eleanor Grayson's house was a modest 2-story with peeling paint and a sagging porch, the kind of place that held stories in its creaks and shadows. The lights were on, a warm glow spilling through the curtains, and Daniel hesitated at the gate. He wasn't good with people, not anymore. Years of disappointment had sanded down his edges, left him quiet and guarded. But he climbed the steps anyway, the wallet a damp weight against his chest, and knocked. The door creaked open after a long moment, revealing a woman who matched the photo, older, frailer, her silver hair pulled into a loose bun. Eleanor's eyes, cloudy with age, widened as they landed on him. She clutched a shawl around her shoulders, her voice trembling. "Yes, can I help you?" Daniel shifted, awkward under her gaze. Ma'am, I found this in the street." He held out the wallet, water dripping onto the porch. "It's yours, I think." Her hands shook as she took it, her fingers brushing the leather like it was something precious. Oh my goodness, I didn't even realize." She opened it, her breath catching as she saw the photo inside. "I must have dropped it this morning. I was so flustered, my arthritis, you see, it's been awful lately." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "You didn't have to do this. Most people wouldn't." Daniel shrugged, shoving his hands back into his pockets. "It's nothing, just figured you'd want it back." "It's not nothing," she said, her voice firm despite its quiver. "Not to me. Please come in. Let me at least get you a towel. You're soaked." He shook his head, already stepping back. "No, I'm fine. Gotta get home. You take care, all right?" Before she could protest, he turned and disappeared into the rain, his boots splashing through puddles as the night swallowed him whole. What Daniel didn't see, what he couldn't have known, was the sleek black car parked across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the dim streetlights. Inside, a woman watched him go, her manicured fingers tapping against the steering wheel. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed and elegant, her coat a deep burgundy that spoke of wealth. Catherine Grayson, Eleanor's daughter, had arrived just in time to see the exchange. She'd been on her way to check on her mother, a rare visit squeezed between board meetings and charity galas. Now her gaze lingered on the stranger's retreating figure, something stirring behind her composed exterior. She didn't know his name, not yet, but she would. Back in his cramped apartment, Daniel peeled off his wet jacket and sank onto the sagging couch, the wallet already fading from his mind. He didn't think about rewards or consequences. He didn't think about the woman in the car or the chain of events he'd just set in motion. All he felt was the ache in his bones and the quiet hum of a life that hadn't turned out the way he'd hoped. The rain tapped against the window, a steady rhythm, and he closed his eyes, unaware that his small, unremarkable choice had just cracked open the door to something bigger, something that would change everything. The next morning broke gray and heavy, the rain reduced to a fine mist that clung to the windows of Daniel's apartment. He woke to the sound of his neighbor's dog barking, a sharp, insistent noise that dragged him from a dream he couldn't quite hold on to. His back ached from the lumpy couch, and the air smelled faintly of damp plaster and yesterday's coffee. He rubbed his eyes, the weight of routine settling over him like a familiar coat. Too tight, too worn, but all he had. There was no work today, just a stretch of empty hours and a nagging reminder to call his landlord about the leaking faucet. He didn't think about the wallet. It was done, a footnote in a day already blurring into the rest. Across town, in a penthouse that gleamed with polished marble and floor-to-ceiling glass, Catherine Grayson sat at a sleek desk, her laptop open to a spreadsheet of quarterly earnings. She was a woman who thrived on control, CEO of Grayson Enterprises, a real estate empire built from her father's modest holdings, her name a quiet legend in boardrooms and society pages. But this morning, her mind wasn't on profit margins or acquisition deals. It was on the man from last night, the one who'd stood dripping on her mother's porch, his voice low and gruff, his eyes avoiding hers. She'd watched him leave, his shoulders hunched against the rain, and something about it had lodged in her chest, a splinter she couldn't ignore. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain coffee cup. She'd built her life on calculated moves, on seeing potential where others saw nothing. And yet this stranger's act, small, unasked for, felt like a puzzle she needed to solve. She picked up her phone and dialed her assistant, her voice crisp. "Lila, I need you to find someone for me. A man, early 40s, about 6 feet, dark hair, worn jacket. He was at my mother's house last night, 8:30 or so, East Hollow. I don't have a name." Lila, used to Catherine's cryptic requests, didn't hesitate. "Anything else to go on?" He returned a wallet. "That's all I've got. Start with the neighborhood, discreetly. I want to know who he is." She hung up before Lila could ask why, her gaze drifting to the city skyline beyond the glass. She didn't know what she was looking for, not yet, but she'd learned long ago to trust her instincts. Meanwhile, Daniel stood in the cramped kitchen of his apartment, staring at the faucet that dripped with maddening precision. He'd meant to fix it weeks ago, but the tools sat unused in a drawer, and the landlord's promises were as empty as the fridge. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and grabbed his coat. The corner store was a 5-minute walk, and he needed milk, bread, something to make the day feel less hollow. The mist coated his face as he stepped outside, his boots scuffing the same pavement he'd walked last night. At the store, he moved through the aisles with the efficiency of habit, his mind drifting. He thought of his daughter Mia, 19 now, living with her mother 2 states away. The last time they'd spoken, her voice had been clipped, distant. "I'm fine, Dad, just busy." He'd sent her a birthday card last month, a $20 bill tucked inside, but she hadn't called to say she'd gotten it. The ache of that silence sat heavy in his chest as he paid for his groceries. The cashier's board, "Have a good one," barely registering. Back at Eleanor's house, the morning unfolded with its own quiet rhythm. She sat at her kitchen table, the wallet open in front of her, her fingers tracing the photo of her and Catherine, taken decades ago when the world felt softer. She hadn't told her daughter about the wallet yet. Catherine was always so busy, so far removed from this little life of hers. But the stranger's kindness lingered, a warmth she hadn't expected. She picked up the phone, her hands trembling slightly, and dialed. "Catherine, dear, it's me," she said when the line clicked. "I had the loveliest thing happen last night." Catherine's voice came through, smooth and distracted. "Oh, what's that, Mom?" "A man found my wallet in the street, brought it right to the door, soaked to the bone. Didn't even stay for a thank you. Can you imagine?" Catherine's fingers stilled on her coffee cup. "Really? That's unusual. Did he say who he was?" "No, just handed it over and left. Looked tired, poor thing. I wish I'd gotten his name." Catherine's mind clicked into gear, the pieces aligning. "Don't worry about it, Mom. I'm glad you're all right. I'll stop by later, okay?" She hung up, her pulse quickening. The man from the porch. She didn't believe in coincidences. Not in her world. By late afternoon, Lila called back. "Found him, I think. Daniel Reese, 42, lives in a rundown complex off Maple Street. Handyman, no steady gig, no record. Neighbors say he keeps to himself. That sound right?" Catherine nodded to herself, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Perfect. Thanks, Lila." She didn't explain, not yet. Instead, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door, the hum of curiosity driving her forward. Daniel, oblivious, spent the afternoon wrestling with the faucet, his hands slick with water and frustration. He didn't hear the car pull up outside, didn't see the woman in burgundy step onto the cracked sidewalk, her eyes scanning the building. When the knock came, sharp and deliberate, he froze, wrench still in hand. He wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping his hands on his jeans, he opened the door and there she was, Catherine Grayson, poised and unreadable, her presence filling the cramped space like a storm rolling in. "Daniel Reese?" she asked, her voice steady, her gaze locking onto his. He blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah, who are you?" She didn't smile, not yet. "My name's Catherine. I think you met my mother last night." His brow furrowed, the wallet flashing back into his mind. Yeah, she all right?" "She's fine, thanks to you." Catherine tilted her head, studying him. "Can I come in? We need to talk." Daniel hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He didn't know it yet, but the door he'd just opened wasn't just to his apartment, it was to a life he'd never imagined. Daniel stepped aside, the door creaking as Catherine Grayson crossed the threshold into his world. The apartment was a stark contrast to her tailored coat and the quiet confidence she carried. Peeling wallpaper, a threadbare rug, the faint hum of a refrigerator that rattled more than it cooled. He gestured vaguely toward the couch, its springs groaning under years of use, and she sat, her posture straight but not stiff, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Daniel stayed standing, arms crossed, his damp shirt clinging to his shoulders from the faucet battle. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. "So," he said, his voice rough, "what's this about? Your mom's wallet?" Catherine's eyes, sharp and assessing, met his. "Yes and no. I saw you last night on her porch. I was in my car about to go in when you showed up." She paused, letting the words settle. "Most people wouldn't have bothered. Why did you?" Daniel shifted, uncomfortable under her gaze. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. Didn't think about it much, just seemed like the right thing. She's old, probably needed it. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile. "The right thing," she echoed as if testing the weight of it. "You didn't take anything, didn't ask for anything, just walked away." He shrugged, his jaw tightening, wasn't looking for a pat on the back. "Look, if she's okay, I don't get why you're here." Catherine leaned forward slightly, her voice softening but no less direct. "Because I don't meet people like you often, Daniel. I run a company, big one. I deal with people every day who'd sell their soul for a favor or a dollar. You didn't even blink." He didn't know what to say to that. The compliment, if it was one, felt foreign, like a coat that didn't fit. He scratched the back of his neck, glancing at the floor. "Just how I was raised, I guess." She studied him for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a card. Simple, cream-colored, her name and a phone number embossed in black. "I'd like to offer you something. A job, maybe, or a chance. I don't know yet, but I'd like to find out what you're capable of." Daniel took the card, his fingers brushing hers, and stared at it like it might bite. "I'm not some charity case," he said, his tone sharper than he meant. "I don't need handouts." "It's not a handout," she replied, unfazed. "It's an opportunity. Think about it." She stood, smoothing her coat. "Call me if you change your mind, or don't. Your choice." And with that, she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her, leaving a silence that felt louder than before. He stood there, card in hand, the faint scent of her perfume lingering. Opportunity. The word rattled around in his head, stirring up dust he'd let settle for years. He tossed the card onto the counter and turned back to the faucet, but his hands wouldn't move. Instead, he sank onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, the drip, drip, drip of water marking time. Across town, Eleanor sat in her living room, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The wallet rested on the table beside her, a quiet reminder of the night before. She hadn't expected Catherine to care so much. She rarely did these days, always rushing between meetings and flights. But when they'd spoken earlier, there'd been a spark in her daughter's voice, something Eleanor hadn't heard in years. She smiled to herself, frail fingers tracing the edge of the photo inside the wallet. Maybe it wasn't just her life that stranger had touched. By evening, Daniel still hadn't moved from the couch. The card sat on the counter, taunting him. He wasn't a dreamer, not anymore. Life had beaten that out of him, one disappointment at a time. His marriage falling apart, Mia drifting away, jobs that paid just enough to keep him afloat but never enough to climb out. And yet Catherine's words gnawed at him. What you're capable of. He didn't know what that meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to. The phone rang, jolting him upright. He grabbed it, expecting the landlord or a bill collector, but the voice on the other end was softer, younger. Dad, it's me. Mia? His heart lurched, a mix of relief and dread. Hey kid, you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. She sounded hesitant, like she was picking her words. I got your card, the birthday one. I've been busy, school and stuff. I didn't mean to not call. It's all right, he said, though it wasn't, not really. Good to hear your voice. There was a pause, then, how are you holding up? Mom said you're still in that shitty apartment. He laughed, a dry, quiet sound. Yeah, well, it's home. Keeps the rain out, mostly. Dad. She trailed off, and he could hear the worry in her silence. You deserve better, you know. The words hit harder than he expected, echoing Catherine's. He swallowed, his throat tight. I'm fine, Mia. Don't worry about me. You just focus on you, all right? Okay, she said, but he knew she didn't believe him. I'll call soon, promise. When the line went dead, he sat there, the phone still in his hand. Mia's voice lingered, small and far away, and for the first time in years, he felt the ache of wanting more. Not for himself, but for her. He glanced at the card on the counter, its edges catching the dim light. Maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe it was about giving her something to be proud of. The next morning, he dialed the number. Catherine picked up on the second ring, her voice calm, expectant. Daniel, I was hoping you'd call. Yeah, he said, his mouth dry. What's this job? Come to my office tomorrow, 10 a.m., we'll figure it out. She didn't gloat, didn't push, just gave him the address and hung up. He set the phone down, his pulse thudding in his ears. Outside, the mist had lifted, the sky a pale, uncertain blue. He didn't know what he was walking into, didn't know that Catherine had already set wheels in motion, quiet inquiries, a plan forming behind her steady gaze. All he knew was that he'd taken a step, small and shaky, and there was no going back. The Grayson Enterprises building loomed over downtown like a monolith of glass and steel, its edges catching the morning light in sharp, clean lines. Daniel stood on the sidewalk, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his least-worn jacket, feeling every bit the outsider. The suit he'd dug out of the closet, a relic from a wedding 10 years ago, itched at the collar, and his boots, scuffed and practical, looked out of place against the polished marble of the lobby. He'd almost turned back twice on the bus ride over, the card in his pocket a tether he wasn't sure he wanted. But Mia's voice from last night, "You deserve better, Dad," kept him moving, one reluctant step at a time. The receptionist, a young woman with a headset and a practiced smile, glanced up as he approached. Name? Daniel Reese, he said, his voice low, like he was testing it. Here for Catherine Grayson. She nodded, tapping at her screen, and a moment later he was in an elevator, the hum of it rising through his chest as it carried him to the 32nd floor. When the doors slid open, Catherine was there, not behind a desk, but standing by a window, her silhouette framed against the city sprawl. She turned, her burgundy coat swapped for a tailored blazer, her expression unreadable but not cold. Daniel, she said, gesturing to a chair across from a sleek desk, you came. Yeah. He sat, the leather creaking under him, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. Still not sure why I'm here. She took her seat, folding her hands on the desk. Let's start with what I know. You're a handyman. No steady work, but you've got skills, plumbing, carpentry, electrical. You live alone, keep your head down, no trouble, no ambition. That about right?" He bristled, though her tone wasn't cruel. "You've been digging." "I have people for that," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I like to know who I'm dealing with, but I'm not here to judge you, Daniel. I'm here to offer you something." He leaned back, arms crossing. "You said that. What's the catch?" "No catch, just a job. We're renovating a property, a community center, low-income area. Need someone who can handle the grunt work but also see the bigger picture. I think that's you." He frowned, the words sinking in slow. "Why me? You don't even know me." "I know enough," she said, her gaze steady. "You didn't have to help my mother, you did anyway. That tells me more than a resume ever could." Daniel looked away out the window where the city stretched gray and endless. A job, a real one, not some day labor gig that barely paid the rent. It sounded too good, and he'd learned long ago that too good usually came with strings. "What's the pay?" "Enough to get you out of that apartment," she said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Details are in there. Start Monday if you want it." He took the folder, flipping it open. Numbers, timelines, a contract with his name already typed at the top. It was more money than he'd seen in years, steady work for months. His chest tightened, a mix of hope and suspicion he couldn't untangle. "And if I say no? Then you walk out and we're done." She leaned back, giving him space. "I'm not here to force you, Daniel. I just think you're worth more than you've let yourself believe." The words hit like a punch, quiet and deep. He closed the folder, his fingers lingering on the edge. "I'll think about it." "Fair enough," she said, standing. "Let me know by tomorrow." He nodded, rising with the folder tucked under his arm, and left without another word. The elevator ride down felt longer, the air heavier. Outside, the city buzzed around him, cars honking, people rushing, but he barely noticed. He walked to a bench a block away and sat, the folder unopened in his lap, his mind churning. Back in her office, Catherine watched him go from the window, her phone already in hand. She dialed her mother, the line crackling before Eleanor's voice came through, soft and warm. "Catherine, everything all right?" "Fine, Mom. I just met him, the man from last night. Offered him a job." Eleanor's breath caught, a small, delighted sound. "Oh, that's wonderful. Did he take it?" "Not yet, he's thinking." Catherine's tone softened. "He's complicated. Tired, I think, but there's something there." "You always did have an eye for people," Eleanor said, a smile in her voice. "Like your father." Catherine's throat tightened. The memory of her father, a quiet man who'd built homes with his hands, flickering briefly. "Maybe. We'll see." That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, the folder spread out in front of him. The faucet still dripped, a steady rhythm against the silence. He traced the numbers with his finger, enough to fix the fridge, pay the rent, maybe send Mia something more than a crumpled 20. He thought of Catherine's words, her steady gaze, and the way she'd seen him when he'd spent years trying not to be seen. He thought of Mia, her voice small on the phone, and the life he hadn't given her. The next morning, he called. "I'm in," he said when Catherine answered, his voice firm despite the tremor in his chest. "Good," she replied, and he could hear the satisfaction in it. "See you Monday." He hung up, the folder still open on the table, and for the first time in years, the drip of the faucet didn't feel like a countdown. It felt like a beginning. Across town, Catherine set her phone down, a plan taking shape behind her eyes. The community center was real, the job legitimate, but it was only the start. She'd seen something in Daniel, a spark buried under years of ash, and she intended to fan it. Not out of charity, but because she knew what it was to be overlooked, to claw your way up from nothing. She'd done it once. Now she'd see if he could too. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the ripples of that rainy night were spreading, pulling him toward a shore he couldn't yet see. Monday morning arrived with a chill that seeped through the thin walls of Daniel's apartment. He woke before the alarm, the folder from Catherine still on the table, its edges curling slightly from the damp air. He dressed in work clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, boots that had seen better days, and grabbed a thermos of coffee, the bitter taste grounding him as he stepped into the gray dawn. The community center was a 20-minute bus ride away in a part of East Hollow where the streets narrowed and the buildings sagged, their windows patched with tape and hope. He didn't know what to expect, but the weight of the job of something felt like a lifeline he couldn't afford to drop. The site was a skeleton of what it might become, A brick husk with exposed beams, piles of drywall, and the hum of power tools already buzzing when he arrived. A foreman, a stocky man named Ray with a clipboard and a no-nonsense squint, greeted him with a nod. "Reese, you're the new guy Grayson sent?" "Yeah," Daniel said, shifting his weight. "Where do you want me?" Ray jerked his thumb toward the back. "Plumbing's a mess, pipes older than my grandma. Start there. Tools are in the shed." Daniel got to work, his hands moving with the muscle memory of years spent fixing what others had broken. The pipes were rusted, the joints leaking, but he lost himself in the rhythm of it. Wrench turning, water hissing, the quiet satisfaction of making something right. Around him, the crew was a mix of gruff voices and quick laughs, men and women who sized him up but didn't pry. He kept his head down the way he always had, but there was a steadiness to the day that felt new, a purpose he hadn't tasted in too long. Across the city, Catherine sat in a boardroom, her voice cutting through the drone of a presentation on profit margins. She was in her element here, sharp, decisive, the kind of woman who could silence a room with a glance. But her mind kept drifting to the community center, to Daniel. She'd checked in with Ray that morning, a casual "how's he doing" that masked the curiosity she wouldn't admit. "Solid worker," Ray had said. "Quiet, but he knows his stuff." It was enough for now. By midday, Daniel took a break, sitting on a stack of lumber with a sandwich from his bag. The crew chatter faded into background noise as he watched the street beyond the chain-link fence, kids kicking a deflated ball, an old man shuffling with a cane. He thought of Eleanor, her trembling hands on the wallet, and wondered if she'd ever come here once it was done. He didn't know why it mattered, but it did. That evening, he stopped by the corner store, the paycheck advance Catherine had arranged burning a hole in his pocket. He bought groceries, real ones, not just bread and milk, and a prepaid phone card. Back home, he dialed Mia, the line crackling before her voice came through, bright but cautious. "Dad, twice in a week, what's up?" "Got a job," he said, leaning against the counter, the faucet finally silent after he'd fixed it the night before. "Real one. Construction. Steady pay." "Seriously?" Her tone lifted, a spark of pride breaking through. "That's awesome. Where?" "Community center, downtown, some big shots project." He hesitated, then added, "Might be able to send you more for school, books or whatever." "Dad, you don't have to," she started, but he cut her off. "I want to. Been too long since I could." His voice thickened and he cleared his throat. "How's classes?" They talked for 20 minutes, longer than they had in years, about her biology labs, the roommate who snored, the professor who smelled like mothballs. When they hung up, the apartment felt less empty, the echo of her laugh lingering in the air. Days turned into weeks, the center taking shape under Daniel's hands and the crew's steady grind. He and Ray fell into an easy rhythm, the older man grumbling about deadlines but clapping Daniel on the shoulder when a tricky fix came through. The work was hard, his body aching by nightfall, but it was good, better than the aimless drift of before. He didn't see Catherine again, though her name floated through the site like a quiet current, a reminder of the choice that had brought him here. One afternoon, as he wrestled with a stubborn valve, a shadow fell across the floor. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow, and there was Eleanor Grayson, her silver hair catching the light, a cane steadying her frail frame. She smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I thought it might be you." Daniel straightened, caught off guard. "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" "Catherine told me about the center," she said, her voice warm. "I wanted to see it. And you." He shifted, awkward under her kindness. "Just doing my job." "It's more than that," she said, stepping closer. "This place, it'll mean something to people because of you." He didn't know how to answer, the weight of her words settling unevenly. "Just fixing pipes," he muttered, but she shook her head. "You fixed more than that, Daniel. You gave me back a piece of myself that night, and now this." She gestured to the half-built walls, the promise of what was coming. "Goodness ripples, you know." He nodded, unsure, and she patted his arm before turning away, her cane tapping a slow rhythm. He watched her go, something stirring in his chest, a crack in the armor he'd worn too long. That night, Catherine got the call from her mother, Eleanor's voice bright with a rare energy. "He's a good man, Catherine. You were right to give him a chance." "I know," Catherine said, a quiet satisfaction in her tone. She'd been watching from a distance, Ray's updates painting a picture of a man finding his footing. But it wasn't enough, not yet. She had bigger plans, ones she hadn't shared with anyone, not even Daniel. The center was just the beginning. For Daniel, the days blurred into a steady hum of work and small victories. Pipes sealed, walls raised, Mia's voice on the phone growing warmer each call. He didn't see the threads tightening around him, didn't know that Eleanor's visit had been more than chance, that Catherine's sharp mind was weaving something larger. All he knew was the ache in his hands and the faint, unfamiliar glow of hope creeping in.